I am Paul Golan. I'm Executive Director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, which is the sponsoring organization of our initiative, pluralistic initiative, Jews for a Secular Democracy. And thanks everybody for being here. Today, we're gonna hear from Tahil Sharma, and I'm gonna read you his bio. And we're just very appreciative of him taking the time to be with us today to talk about successfully engaging in interfaith spaces. Tahil is an interfaith activist based in LA who was born to a Hindu father and a Sikh mother, who works as the North American coordinator for United Religions Initiative, the world's largest grassroots interfaith network. Following the Oak Creek, Wisconsin shooting of a Sikh temple in 2012, Tahil became involved in efforts for interfaith literacy and social justice and has been doing this work professionally for the past 7 years. Tahil serves as one of 3 interfaith ministers in residence for the Episcopal Diocese of Los Angeles and as the Los Angeles coordinator for Sadhana, a coalition of progressive Hindus. Tahil also serves various organizations in different capacities to educate, engage, and serve various communities that promote interfaith cooperation and ethical pluralism and social and productive norms in society, including the Interfaith Youth Corps, the Parliament of World Religions, the Gubord Center, am I saying that right?
Gubord Center.
Gubord Center, and the Interreligious Council of Southern California. He's also a contributing author to books including Co-Human Harmony, Using Our Shared Humanity to Bridge Divides, Hindu Approaches to Spiritual Care, Chaplaincy in Theory and Practice, and Acting on Faith, Stories of Courage, Activism, and Hope Across Religions. Again, thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna hide my video and put your PowerPoint up, and we're doing this so that I think in theory, people are able to adjust the size of the windows between the speaker and the PowerPoint. I hope this helps because I know one of the limitations of Zoom is when someone uses a PowerPoint themselves, their window becomes very small and the PowerPoint takes over, and we're trying to see if we can't mitigate that. So just give me 1 second, but why don't you take it away, Tahil, and I'll do that.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Paul. And thank you all for joining this call today. I'm really excited to be, sharing some of my story with you and getting the opportunity to really engage with you all in this conversation on interfaith cooperation. For many folks who may be engaged with the current body politic, we know that it is not an easy time. It continues to be a difficult time dealing with politics. And when we talk about the separation of church and state, there's no doubt in my mind that we are going through a lot of different conversations, a lot of different experiences. And what I'm sharing with you all today is an opportunity and an experience to think about how people from other traditions and worldviews engage in justice. And just to give a bit of a disclaimer, this is coming from my personal experience at doing interfaith cooperation. I don't speak for all of the folks that come from my religious communities, nor do I speak for the entire interfaith community, because as an engaging intersectional space, we all are allowed to have different voices and perspectives. So I want that to be the primer for how we engage in this conversation on interfaith cooperation today. Paul, next slide, please. So some questions that that I'm going to discuss with you all that I'd like all of you to think about are the definitions to these following words and phrases: interfaith cooperation, pluralism, and the separation of church and state. For many of us, these terms are very familiar, especially that last one. For some of us, these terms might be loaded, and for some of us, these terms might be what we, live by and thrive on. And I want to start off with this first question on what is interfaith cooperation? Paul, next slide, please. According to the Interfaith Youth Corps, which is the largest student-based interfaith organization in the United States. Interfaith is a process in which people who orient around religion differently come together in ways that respect different identities, build mutually inspiring relationships, and engage in common action around issues of shared concern. Where meaningful interfaith cooperation happens, there is less polarization, and communities are stronger and more resilient. In a nutshell, interfaith is a lot of different components that go, I think, a step beyond just recognizing that we have religious diversity. It takes us to a new level when we're intentionally creating space to learn about one another, when we're actually finding the ways and opportunities to connect with each other, and we learn that we have common concerns that we all want to address together. And that's how we kind of sum it up in a larger frame of what interfaith cooperation is. Next slide, please. But the value of interfaith cooperation is that you can make it look like whatever feels right for you. So what can interfaith cooperation look like? It can look like literacy, taking the opportunity to actually learn about different communities, where they come from, what their baggage might be, what their histories might be, and what are some challenges they're facing now. Understanding, taking the opportunity to offer a listening ear to what other communities are experiencing. Dialogue, actually communicating with them, learning about them, getting to know who they are, what they're about. Bridge building, making those communications consistent so that you have an opportunity to continue that ebb and flow of knowledge sharing and value sharing. Friendships, that's a great place to be able to meet new people from all backgrounds and all different parts of life. Solidarity, when we are going through difficult situations in our communities, we know that we can lean on one another to be able to mourn and to be able to build resilience. Community organizing and movement building, thinking about the ways in which multiple strategies and resources can come together to actually fight for justice. That is ultimately a culture and a paradigm shift that we can establish. So when someone asks you what interfaith is, it's a culmination of all of these things. And more importantly, there isn't a definition that you can't include in this conversation on interfaith. It can be anywhere from learning to dialogue to organizing to action. And that entire spectrum is what makes interfaith cooperation so amazing, inclusive, and intersectional. Because it's not just about the difference of beliefs and opinions and worldviews. It's an attachment to all of the other identities that we might share that allow us to actually be our whole selves. Next slide, please. So one thing that actually makes interfaith cooperation different is it's not just about recognizing what is diverse. It's actually about recognizing that there's a narrative and a practice of pluralism. For those of you that might know of those two words, they definitely don't mean the same thing. Diversity at its core is talking about the inclusion of different types of people in a group, in an organization, or in a community. When you intentionally include people within a space, you're creating diversity. But the difference is that in diversity, you're not actually making these people interact with one another. We may live, for example, I live in the city of Los Angeles. We're supposed to be recognized as one of the most religiously diverse cities in the world, with over 10,000 unique congregations from dozens of different traditions from around the world. But there's a reason why we're called the most religiously diverse, and it's because almost all of these communities don't actually interact with each other. They coexist with one another. Some of them may know about each other. Some of them may actually work with one another. But it's not as a part of one cohesive unit or community of people in the city of LA, which means we're not actually taking full advantage of the capacity that we have in creating collaboration and bridge building between these communities. And that's why we're really striving for stepping from diversity into pluralism. Pluralism is a state of society in which members of diverse ethnic, racial, religious, or social groups maintain and develop their traditional culture or special interest within the confines of a common civilization. So I, as a Hindu and a Sikh, coming from the background that I come from, have the capacity to actually participate in pluralism without thinking that I'm losing my values or my practices. And that's the common interest and the common investment that we want to remind people about when they come into this space with us. So it's not just about, okay, I'm getting to learn about another community and it might change my perspective. We want you to bring your whole selves into this space while acknowledging, accepting, and working intentionally with other people. While these communities retain their unique identities and worldviews, they acknowledge the ability to have shared values and experiences with others who aren't from their community. So this overlap can often be seen in spaces where we can talk about even singular religions. Oftentimes there are spaces created within Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Hindu, and atheist communities that actually talk about being able to address the concerns of people who are people of color. People who may be indigenous, specifically people who may be Black during current circumstances with the Black Lives Matter movement. When we're talking about the inclusion of LGBTQ identity people, when we are talking about folks that are from other minority traditions, we want them to be a part of a bigger conversation that involves us. And we have to keep reminding people that you don't lose anything in the process, that it's a process for us to gain, and it's a process for us to engage. That's the key difference between diversity and pluralism. Pluralism is the active engagement of diversity. Next slide, please. There's a process that I sort of came up with as I heard this quote from Dr. Diane Eck from Harvard Divinity School. She mentions a quote that says, "Diversity is a fact, but pluralism is an achievement." Diversity is a fact, pluralism is an achievement. What really changes that perspective is that point that I made about communities engaging with one another. So I kind of expanded this model to make you think about the ways that you're stepping through this experience of going from an idea that we are all equal as human beings to actually creating equity for all people, which will manifest a culture of justice and peace. So first, equality is a given. You know that human beings are equal, but you don't actually have the understanding that you feel you're comfortable with to see that people are unique. People have different experiences. So what you do is you create inclusion and representation in these spaces to make them diverse. By engaging in diversity, you're creating a space where you see multiple perspectives. But if those communities don't work together and actually deeply learn about one another, then they're not actually going further. So when you put a space for inquiry and engagement, you can then create the process of pluralism, where there is an active engagement between diverse communities. But you can't stop at pluralism to be okay. We have to understand that that the society and many others have been created on an unequal platform for many communities, which means you have to take that diverse engagement and actually pursue justice and pursue organizing of those communities to actually achieve equity, where it's not just about we feel that we're equal, but we have equal access, we have equal opportunity, we have equal support, and we have contextual understanding of the needs of every community in our society. That latter is what gets us further in this process of achieving a world of peace. Next slide, please. Before I step into this, I think one of my slides may have dropped out for some reason, which is totally okay. I think it's possible that when I added one slide in particular, it might have just dropped off somewhere. So I'm just gonna wing it and talk about what that sort of mentioned. From my personal story, I grew up with an interreligious identity as a Hindu and a Sikh. So for me, having those true traditions at home meant a lot of good things and a lot of pretty difficult things. I had the appreciation of getting to see two blessed visions of what I understand to be the divine. One tradition that's 5,000 years old and another that's 500 years old. They gave me an opportunity to learn divine languages, to seek more divine love, to provide divine service to others, and to create some, and to try some very divine food that I will never miss out on. Um, but with that, I've also come to understand that there is a lot of unease when people hear about someone identifying as being dual religious or interreligious. And oftentimes that conversation comes with a lot of misunderstandings, a lot of assumptions, and a lot of deeply rooted judgments, unfortunately. Um, I've had, I've found out from friends that their family members thought that I was confused about religion, that I'm lost, that I'm an abomination, and that I actually don't have any idea what religion even is. And the fact of the matter is I kind of understood that I had to turn the tables on them and say, actually, I don't think you have an understanding of what religion and spirituality is, because it's an ever-changing thing. It has never been so concretely consistent in history for us to be able to say that it has not adjusted to our needs in a community. And for religion to last thousands of years, it's precisely the proof that we need that it's very contextual and it's very much a developing experience. Um, and the story of what happened in 2012 particularly affected me because when a Gurdwara or a Sikh temple was shot in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, it was shot by a white supremacist, someone who thought was entering a Muslim mosque, trying to kill Muslims, actually killed people from another religious community. Not only is that painfully regrettable, not only is that deplorable, but the fact that there's so much confusion in someone's ignorance that they're going out to kill people in the name of what they find to be justification, only to kill another community, makes things even more complicated than they already are. Because the first conversations that came out of that shooting were not about the stories of the people that were killed. It was about the community that no one knew about. In the fifth largest populous religion in the world, no one knew what Sikhism was. The founder was, when the religion was established, what the belief structure was, and if they knew people from the community, which was very telling of, one, the disappointment that I had in my identities intersecting and not agreeing with each other for the first time, and two, the helplessness that I felt that people didn't even know who I was as a person, but were able to connect themselves with me. So I turned to my own scriptures and I said, what do I do in this situation? I've kind of checked out and I don't know what to do in trying to make a difference. And there were two phrases that came out of the first line of the Guru Granth Sahib, or the six scriptures, that continue to resonate with me today. And those are Nirbhau and Nirvair. Nirbhau means without fear, and Nirvair means without hatred. Those are two qualities that we associate with the divine in Sikhism. That God is one that does not have fear or hatred for creation. And it made me think about how I, as a Hindu, as a Sikh, as an Indian American, and as someone who deeply felt rooted in this act of service towards mankind, that I have to approach life the same way. I have to be without fear and hatred towards anyone else, even those that might attack me or my community. So I took a step up and I said, you know what? I think it's time for me to really take this by the horns. Rather than stepping away from the trap of white supremacy, which wants me to be angry, which wants me to be disappointed, which wants me to be scared, and which wants me to divide me amongst myself and my fellow community members, I'm going to push back and share my solidarity and strength with everyone else in need. And when it came down to it, that's what informed my last 7 or 8 years of doing this work. I started with doing the basics of what interfaith looked like, which was visiting mosques and synagogues and temples and Sunday meetings for atheist united communities in the area to really learn about other communities. We started a community bet together which grew vegetables for a food pantry. Um, and we started having these really basic dialogues. Then years later, that work turned into me being an organizer and activist on the ground, pushing back against the mistreatment of separated asylum seekers at the border, to calling out the Islamophobia and the anti-Semitism that has come out of members of this administration and community members on the ground. It's been trying to repel the hatred and bigotry that's been affecting a lot of my fellow community members, that it doesn't need to affect me to know that I still need to make a difference and stand up for them. That story, that experience informs my reasoning and my logic for looking at social justice and human rights through a lens of interfaith cooperation. And the necessity for that for faith communities like the Jewish community, like the secular humanist and atheist communities, to every other person on that spectrum of belief, we need to be standing together to be able to repel this hatred and to repel the opportunity to be ruled by singular identities. And this is where we come to this conversation on interfaith cooperation and the separation of church and state. The interfaith movement depends heavily on this separation, because the separation of church and state is something that we have pushed through the First Amendment of the US Constitution, that no singular religion can be used as a way to rule above all the people in the United States. And for us as people coming from diverse faith communities or secular communities, that bolsters our religious freedom. That bolsters our First Amendment right to freedom of religion or freedom from religion. It maintains that no religion dictates the law of the land. It encourages solidarity and engagement between communities for equal protection under the law. So if any of us gets hurt, all of us get hurt. And as Dr. King says, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that's where faith communities have to play a very essential role in standing together, not just as allies, but as accomplices to justice. Because when one of us goes silent when someone else from another community is hurt, we forget that it runs the risk of hurting us too. It's already hurt us by hurting one of our fellow community members. But once that pain and that suffering gets closer, it can always be too late. And there's that very famous comparison that was made by, I forget the name of the person. First they came for the socialists and I did nothing, and then they came for other people, and when it came to me, I couldn't do anything because no one was there for me. That's a very similar way of how we need to address those things now. And most importantly, it demonstrates the need for contextual accommodation for communities, not the removal of their rights. So there's an important thing that I'm trying to say there, because oftentimes when we talk about the separation of church and state, we are implying the point that communities and government, religious communities and government should not be too gung-ho with each other. We're trying to make that very clear. But what we do have to understand is that all communities that are religious or secular don't have the same needs. And when it comes to moments of discrimination, when it comes to moments of accommodation, when it comes to moments of providing for the needs of these communities, they're not all the same. And what we have to think about in the conversation of the separation of church and state is how we accommodate each other and make sure we can all show up for each other. For those that might wear religious coverings on their head or on their body, for each of us to be entitled to the free speech and freedom of the practice of our traditions. For example, as I wear my bracelets or karas, just as someone from the Jewish faith might be wearing a kippah, just like a Muslim woman might be wearing a hijab, or just like a Christian man or woman might wear a cross around their neck. All of those expressions are contextually relevant to us, and we therefore have ways to accommodate us to be able to behold and to represent ourselves in our communities by wearing those things. And oftentimes in these conversations of religious freedom, we often misconstrue those accommodations that we need for actually taking away rights from people. There are a number of cases that went in front of the Supreme Court, including the Hobby Lobby case about covering abortion, to the case of the baker who did not want to make a cake for a gay couple, where folks are not allowed to actually do what is a part of the daily routine of being an American citizen or a human being. And that's where we need to make a major differentiation here. It's very important for us to consider that there's a difference between helping make sure that we achieve equality rather than taking away rights from people. And I'm not just saying that because we are talking about it from the context of the 21st century. If we look back at how we understand, the Bill of Rights and how they became a part of the US Constitution, we also have to think about the mindset of the framers or the founders of these documents and of this country. We know that they have a significant burden on them for being slave owners and slave traders and the like. I don't think those things can ever be denied, and it's an equal part of a history that we need to acknowledge in this current moment. But even then, they had a sense of an interfaith narrative that informed their opportunity to be able to work on these issues and stand up for the freedom of religion. We have the letter that George Washington, the first president, wrote to the Hebrew congregation on the East Coast, saying that your rights will not be removed and you'll be able to pursue the rights as everyone else does. And there was a conversation that was had at the Virginia House of Representatives that talked about this idea of striving for equality for all people. And it mentioned this point about being the God of Abraham in that text. And there was a disagreement that actually came up between members of the House. And in Thomas Jefferson's autobiography about this moment, he actually talks about this point, that in this disagreement, there was an acknowledgement of the Jew and the Gentile, of the Mohammedan and the atheist, and for all people to be included in the language of fighting for religious freedom. And to recognize that all the way back in the 18th century is pretty phenomenal to think about. But what it also means is we actually have to set a better precedent in how we pursue that justice and equity in the name of interfaith organizing and cooperation that retains this idea of a separation of church and state. And if we're going to do that, we need to find the best practices of how we're going to engage each other in interfaith cooperation. So this is something that I actually wanted to show because I was verbalizing everything that I actually put into this image in particular. This is a group of colleagues and I from the University of Laverne, where we visited a local mosque for their open mosque day. Here are some colleagues and I working on the community beds that I was talking about to harvest fruits and vegetables for a local food pantry. And this is me right here in 2018, marching with hundreds of faith leaders, priests and pastors, rabbis and cantors, imams and sheikhs, and myself with many folks from many other traditions and activists and community organizers, marching at the US-Mexico border, demanding for justice for asylum seekers coming from Central America. That was a big part of what we were noticing from actions of the Trump administration in 2018. And this is what Interfaith ended up looking like for all of us standing there. The first 100 of us that you see standing in the front, as a matter of fact, a third of this group was arrested. Some were thrown to the ground, some were taken away, some had charges on them for quite some time. And it was an experience that sort of got international attention for the kind of dramatic and unnecessary altercation that took place between all of us as religious and spiritual people and the CBP or the Border Patrol. Each of these three images are all different ways of doing interfaith work, yet they all have legitimacy they all have power, and they all make a difference. And that's why they each deserve to have their certain amount of attention in the work that we do individually, which is why I want to go to the second to last slide, Paul, if you don't mind. Because what requires you to make interfaith cooperation effective are several things. And a few of them are listed here because I felt like, from my experience very deeply, it has to start with a strong footing before you really take it to a meaningful action at the end of the day. So first and foremost, you have to learn to tell your story. Every person has a story rich with details and identities that are worth sharing. I need you and we need you in the interfaith movement for the entire person that you are. Oftentimes we like to talk about this idea that I don't care who you are as long as you're a good person. It doesn't matter what religion you come from, what ethnicity you are, da 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 da, as long as you care about others, as long as you want the world to be a better place. I'm actually challenging you to not think that way. Because if you're not willing to put the effort to learn about people in the beginning, then you shouldn't put the effort to engage in interfaith cooperation in the first place. This is why you have to also hear their stories. We can find inspiration and beauty in the stories of others, and we have to be intentional about listening to them and learning about them. It's not just picking up a story and doing it as a show and tell. It's actually engaging them with active listening. It's engaging them in an appreciative inquiry about who they are and actually taking away something deeply meaningful from their experience. The third thing that you should do is get uncomfortable. Now, I'm not telling you to put yourself into dangerous situations. Some of the things that I've participated in have been dangerous situations, but those are things I've chosen to participate in because it's a part of my religious practice to engage in justice at all costs, to myself personally. But this discomfort actually can come from a lot of different things. It can come from a disagreement. It can come from someone's worldview being different from yours. It can be something that makes you engage in a deeper conversation. That's why, to me, disagreement of these kinds is key for transformation. It's a very unique way of how we understand diversity, because we often assume that diversity destroys the opportunity to come to a common place or a common ground. When, as a matter of fact, we're trying to create an equitable ground. We're trying to create a place where all of us are raised, all of us are represented, and all of us are taken care of. We're trying to be in abundance with each other. That's why you have to value difference and build your resistance accordingly. It's okay to disagree and leave a conversation. And it's okay to be able to believe different things from other people, yet still find common conclusions. So long as you're not sacrificing the idea of your values, your worldview, or the sacredness of human life, or the life of creation itself, then you should be able to engage more deeply with that person. And the last thing is making a difference. Now, making a difference sounds extremely vague. But as you've noted from some of the things that I've mentioned already, making a difference is very easy and very complicated at the same time. But it requires you to think about how you want to make a difference. We need you in the movement for a better world. And we want you to play a role, no matter how big or small that role is. And it's because you have gifts and skills and resources and energy that this movement deserves, and that you deserve to make a better world. And we want you to bring in your best self by acknowledging that there are ways that you can make that difference. It can be through organizing a march. And under COVID circumstances, I would not recommend doing that. But that's something to think about in the future. You can organize a petition drive. You can create a community garden to grow vegetables and fruits for a food pantry. You can make your own food pantry where people can contribute to things. You can create a dialogue series. You can engage with your political officials. The list goes on and on for the ways that you can make an impact. And what we want you to do is make that investment to make an impact. We want you to start being a part of this movement for change if you haven't started already. Last slide, please. So before I answer all of your questions, if you happen to have any, I just want to share some of these resources. I let folks know that you're more than welcome to have this slideshow that I've created so that you can use it or think about things. I wrote an article for the Huffington Post a couple of years ago called "The Crocodile Tears of Religious Liberty" about this exact point of the historical context and the misnomering of religious liberty to take away rights from others, which is deeply engaging similar points to the conversation that we had today. I participated in a panel for Americans United for the Separation of Church and State, where we talked about religious freedom as a social justice issue. And what was really important about this conversation was its relevance to the current Black Lives Matter movement. I'd like to engage any of you in any further conversations or questions that you might have. You can find me on Google or on social media, and I also have my website, tahilsharma.com. And for my organization, I didn't get an opportunity to share this, but my organization is called the United Religions Initiative. We are 1,050 chapter organizations in 108 countries. It's a very big organization, and as the North American Regional Coordinator, I get to support about 90 of these organizations in the United States and Canada, focusing on this idea that we want interfaith cooperation not to just be a norm, but an intentional daily routine. If we want to create cultures of justice and peace, we have to be very intentional about who we work with, who we collaborate with, and how we actually improve our society as a whole. And we are trying to do a lot of different projects right now that we'd love for you all to come check out and when you have the opportunity. And I'll wrap that up and sort of open the floor for folks that might have questions.
Thank you so much. That was amazing and really helpful. And I feel like we're so lucky to have you on our side, frankly. I think that there are a couple of questions in the Q&A maybe, but oh, no, they were answered. But I have a couple of questions, and I encourage people who are attending to write questions in the Q&A box, and maybe Sarah and Lincoln can also check in the chat as well. So I agree with you 100%. So anything that I bring up is because of challenges that I've had in doing this in part. So just by point of clarification though, because you use the phrase the interfaith community, and then you had a slide that said equality is a given, right? So is it fair to say that when you say the interfaith community, you're not talking about faiths that would deny that all people are equal? I mean, it's not the entire spectrum of religions and non-religions.
Right. You know, for me personally, I would agree with you. It wouldn't necessarily include everyone, including people who might dehumanize us, because that would be very redundant. It's sort of the dilemma of tolerance, of how far does our tolerance go with people? Inevitably, when I refer to, the spectrum of belief of people that can get involved, there is at least some inclination to this idea that the truths of others is valid or that their existence is valid. So obviously there are communities that may not agree with that about a specific community, or about, entire communities that are compartmentalized together into one space. Arguably enough, the interfaith community or the interfaith movement is often considered the one that focuses on kumbaya and peace and harmony, and doesn't address differences. My interfaith movement, the one that I see, totally does. So again, to the point of disagreement, those things are going to keep happening in terms of semantics. But I think understandably, yes, there is a need to think about the ways that inclusion and stepping away from tolerance into acceptance for those who are willing to start the conversation or be on that same page.
Right. Because, at the end of that slide, it was, suggesting that equity is the goal. So, and to me, so I feel like you're laying out some ground rules that certainly everyone, I think, in our movement and involved in this initiative would agree with, which is that, human beings all have infinite value. There's not a better human based on their belief system than another, right? And the goal should be that everyone has equal opportunity, and it's not, people are not facing discrimination and so on. So I think that um, obviously within those ground rules, you do cover a wide spectrum of beliefs, but it does exclude people who probably wouldn't want to be around the table anyway. But I think it's kind of fair to point that out. And then a kind of related question or challenge that I've uh, felt, and you're kind of addressing it. I really like the way you're saying that it's okay to disagree. It's okay to debate. It's okay once you've established those ground rules, and you're saying, look, you have infinite value. I'm not of greater value than you, but here's what I believe, and here's why I think you're wrong, right? Then, that, because that gets at the challenge I'm going to bring up, which is for non-theistic people like me, being a part of an interfaith, when the word faith is already part of the word interfaith. For some of us, it automatically makes us feel excluded from the conversation. And I think on the other side of things, people of faith who are in other interfaith coalitions feel like we are rejecting everything that they stand for by not being of faith. So how do you incorporate non-theistic, and secular humanistic Judaism considers itself a religion, a non-theistic religion. So what's your experience been? And you mentioned attending, I think you said, American atheist groups. So what has your experience been in terms of incorporating belief and non-belief?
That's a great question. And it's something that I've actually called out a lot of religious and interfaith communities on, for not being intentional about including atheists, agnostics, and secular humanists in their conversations on interfaith work, because the term faith is a fatal one. It's a make or break deal when it comes to trying to include people who don't have a concept of faith, and therefore feel like they're not welcome to the conversation. Unfortunately, it's just a terminology problem that therefore seems exclusive. And I want to make it very clear that the interfaith movement is welcoming to those who don't have a faith. Um, but in terms of my engagement personally, I've been working a lot with colleagues here in LA through Atheists United, which is a local Los Angeles-based organization of atheists and free thinkers. They invited me to have this conversation on pluralism, which is a term that I actually use more often, I think, than interfaith, when I'm outside of the circle of interfaith folks, because I think pluralism itself is something that we're striving for, that not only includes the balance of folks that might have a spectrum of belief, but it also includes the spectrum of identities that we want to be a part of the conversation too. So I think linguistically, pluralism is a very good word, in my opinion, to define what we're trying to do. And that it's not just religious people, but actually people of all backgrounds that we want to engage in this process. And to be honest, the same issues that I call out religious communities for, and not including atheists and agnostics and secular humanists, I've also had that same struggle with colleagues in the atheist and secular humanist community who also dehumanize and also make fun of, and go flat out to insult people who might be religious. Right. And there's a point to where some of those attitudes really need to change, and that might have a lot to do with the implicit bias of both religious people and secular people about each other. And we need to create more intentional spaces to have them be in conversation. That no, not every religious person is a lunatic that is carrying their sacred book and trying to shove it down your throat. And that an atheist is not someone who has horns on their head and a spiky tail on the back and is trying to, get you to go to hell. Because we're examining these through the lens of extremes, because everyone kind of falls in the middle and no one focuses on that.
Well, and most of us, not all of us, most of us don't have the horns in that. But
right.
Well, we have a bunch of questions coming in, so I just want to flag those.
I appreciate that answer. And all I would just say is there's dogmatism on all sides, even inside the atheist community. And I think that's part of the challenge is to address that. So I really appreciate your answer. And so what I've done is work around some of the language. Words can always be tricky, but a lot of statements we've been asked to sign on to in an interfaith approach start with phrases like, as people of faith, we blah, blah, blah. Now, if I really needed to, I can say, I have faith. Like, I have faith that humanity will find a vaccine that will work to fix coronavirus. That I put my faith in humanity. So
exactly.
I could sign on to that still, but it makes me feel marginalized. And I think that's the piece that even the dogmatists are actually expressing with their anger, is the feeling that they've been marginalized. And maybe a way to get at it is to address that people have been marginalized in this interfaith community. We're in this community together because almost all of us have been marginalized by another or larger or more dominant, powerful religious community that isn't at the table. And how do we address that? So yes, we do have a bunch of questions, which I appreciate.
A lot of questions. So we'll start with Victoria's. She said, I so appreciate your point that we have to listen and engage with people's stories rather than to just say, as long as you're a good person, I don't care. Because that could be interpreted as, I'm not interested in who you are. I don't think I can learn from it. This provides us language to challenge that. Is there anything more you'd want to add as far as language that we can use to challenge this?
That's a great question, Victoria. I appreciate that. One thing that's helped me a lot, and I've learned that in the last several years of trying to do this work, when we try to tell our stories and learn about the stories of others, we kind of leave it as if it's just a book that we've picked up. We pick up the book, we read through the pages, we finish the book, and we put it down. We shouldn't be treating each other like books, because we're not just meant to be read, we're meant to be understood. So what we have to think about is, how do you take the next step of a story into something deeper? You ask questions. And I think in learning about other people's stories, you need to think about the questions you ask them. Pay attention to what they're saying. That's why I use the term active listening, because you're not just hearing them, you're wanting to know more. You're wanting them to dig deeper into their story, that more than what you might typically hear from someone, so that you can learn how you connect with them more. What are some different things that they've experienced that you haven't? And what are ways that you can work with them in the future once that takes place? We also happen to call that appreciative inquiry, because we are trying to create spaces where us as community members, each of us has a thing to contribute to society and to the world. So when you talk about appreciative inquiry, you're trying to find the ways that you're not only connected, but that each of us has different strong suits to be able to support a common issue. And once you create that kind of a narrative that you share with other people, it'll continue to push this idea that we need to dig deeper to understand each other. That a conviction is not conviction without the number of circumstances and contexts that inform that conviction.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Another question from Richard. He said, have you succeeded in building bridges of agreement between people who previously were at loggerheads with each other, or at least projects that people previously at loggerheads were able to work on together?
You know, that's a great question. In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. These have not been overnight um, solutions to things. But I can give you a very on-ground example. There was a woman that I met at a rally who was protesting against um, the Muslim community and immigrants and others following the San Bernardino attacks that took place at a medical center. They were saying that they were there to show solidarity to the people that died, but a slew of different, members of the KKK, neo-Nazis, and a lot of others that we didn't want there showed up. I was standing on the opposite corner with a bunch of activists from different faith communities and activist communities to protest what they were doing because they were using this solidarity as a guise to justify hate. There was a woman that came over to our side and was trying to mock us. And she had a very cute dog. And I wanted to pet the dog because the dog was cute. I walked over and I asked her if I could pet the dog. She kind of got weirded out by the question, but she said, yeah, sure, pet the dog. And I said, this dog probably understands more about love than all of us because we're just here bickering. And she said, well, to be fair, the dog has a small brain and doesn't understand anything, so it's just going to be there. That started a 45-minute conversation about her assuming my identities, about dehumanizing me, about calling me names, about, not standing with the president because he's doing the right thing. A plethora of different things got thrown at me, and I did what I could to actively listen, to engage in her questions, and to actually deconstruct her convictions with her. She told me, for example, that she did a lot of research after the September 11th attacks about Islam, and that Sharia law is going to ruin everything. And I said, well, ma'am, did you know that there isn't just one type of Sharia law? That it can change per country, and if Muslims are in a non-Muslim majority country, that their Sharia, their jurisprudence is actually the law of the land. So in the United States, it's the Constitution. And she's like, I didn't know that. And I'm like, did you also know that they have an individual Sharia where they have to learn individually about developing their moral compass? And she said, I didn't know that either. And I'm like, well, see, maybe you didn't do all of your research. And that's how you develop a mindset with someone that makes them think deeper about their convictions, about their beliefs, about where they're getting their information. And that end of that conversation, I challenged her to look at her own side of where she was protesting, to only find that she had seen signs that said refugees are not welcome here, that there was a picture of Mecca that said all of this for a kebab, which gets into very disgusting narratives and the like, that goat lives matter, which is related to jokes that I don't even want to consider talking about, and a very clear sign that said Islam is un-American. And I asked her, ma'am, do you believe in any of those things? Do you agree with any of those things? And she said, no, I don't. And I'm like, then you have to think about what you're standing for. Because when you join them and you stand with them, you are a part of that. And what I'm asking you to do is, if you want me to calm people down and talk to them realistically, the least you can do is the same thing. After 45 minutes of engaging in difficult conversation, this woman thanked me for making me think about things in a bigger picture way, told me God bless you, and left. That doesn't happen all the time. That happens 1 or 0.1% of the time. But it's all about that engagement and what you're trying to get across. I can't change her mind. I'm not allowed to change her mind. But I can plant a seed of transformation by making her think about what she believes and what she thinks without actually destroying her worldview. Because it's something that if she's dehumanizing people, that she needs to introspect about and take it out of her system herself.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Paul, how many more questions do you think I can?
Well, why don't we do 2 more, but I'd like to pick one, and then you can pick the one remaining really good one.
Okay, good. Go ahead.
David does ask a question that also speaks to me personally about intermarriage. He says, your background in many ways reflects the essence of America as a melting pot. However, many religions, our own including Judaism, frown on intermarriage as a serious threat to assimilation. How can religions agree on pluralism if they really may not share many, if any, values?
That's a great question. And I will say with complete transparency that my parents went through a lot of struggles because of their interfaith marriage. I won't deny that one bit. My father's family was very much in denial about my father's marriage to not only a woman who was not even a part of the same caste as my family, but was of a completely different religion. Even while supporting communities on the ground that might have been of different religions, when it affected their family personally, they took a 180. And a lot of that, comes down to the interpretations of our sacred texts. It comes to the dialogue between our religious leaders, and it comes ultimately down to the community and how we see ourselves develop and flourish. And a lot of these kinds of deep conversations, oftentimes the general public doesn't engage in. Because the minute we start getting into theology, the minute we start getting into dogma, people check out really quickly. And I understand, even though I really enjoy it now. I didn't before. What you have to really think about is, challenging the way that people understand ritual and practice and belief based on the stringent idea that tradition has been the only way things have functioned. I really like it when I hear from Jewish community members that things cannot change because of tradition, because when I think about the rabbinic debate-based past of this community for centuries, I find a comment like that almost hilarious, because I'm like, that's really not about your culture. It's really the tradition of challenging how things are understood and made up to be able to really take them forward and make them relevant and contextual. And that's just the Jewish community. Arguably enough, other faith communities are going through the same struggle while not understanding that this is all about interpretation. This is all about how customs change. Because religion is such, we're not changing the image and concept of God. We're just seeing how God adjusts his or herself to how we live. It is way more complicated than we're actually making it.
Great, thanks. And I think Sarah got frozen and
she seems to be back.
But
I'm back. Sorry about that.
Right, good. You get to ask you get to pick the last question.
Okay, great. So this is from another David. He said, I'm sure that Jews and humanistic Jews might have an easier time entering interfaith spaces. How do atheists do so? He said, I've done so in Orlando, but hear about significant issues for others trying to do so elsewhere in Florida.
That's an interesting question, because I think the relationship of the Jewish community with the secular Jewish community is a very unique one, because a lot of other faith communities you are either religious and you're a part of our community, or you're not at all. It can be very challenging to be a Hindu atheist and a Muslim atheist and other things, because there's a very direct relationship between divinity and your practice as an adherent of that community. So I will say it's an uphill battle, that's for sure. We do have to think about how people are rejected and ostracized for their discomfort or their disbelief or their leaving of a tradition. And actually, walking with them in a process of transitioning out that I don't think we really think about often, because there's a rejectionist way of viewing how people leave religion. There isn't a way of really saying that you can still build a connection with them, even if they're not religiously affiliated with you anymore. We don't talk about that kind of thing, because a lot of communities see it as an all or nothing. So I wish I could provide a more significant answer, but I really can't. And that's just to be transparent and real about something that I've noticed people go through. I think especially during COVID, I can't tell you the number of people who are having a crisis of faith right now because of what they're seeing on the ground, or because what they're seeing in the public square, but because they also don't know what to do with themselves in this entire process. And I think having people walk with them and make them understand that there are ways of making sense of it all that doesn't depend on the guide, but it depends on you as the participant, is what's key.
Right. Yeah, I think that this is similar to what I was saying before, just in terms of inclusive language. You know, if there are things like of people of all faiths and no faith, right? The throwing in of the no faith would allow atheists to get involved. But the bottom line, I think, that I'd like to say to the atheist community is that on most, if not all, of the issues that these interfaith communities are coming together around, as far as separation of church and state goes, there's no daylight between our end goal of protecting the separation of church and state. I mean, that benefits atheist communities in the exact same way as it benefits Jews and Hindus and Sikhs. So, you know, I think if we can identify the common ground, then it provides us with that opportunity to bring people together. And I really appreciate what you've said, and we hope to be able to continue to engage with your organization and keep you posted about what we're doing as Jews for a Secular Democracy, and also however we might be able to participate in the things that you're putting together. We'd love to continue and to do that with you.
I'd absolutely love that. And I share so much appreciation to you, Paul, to you, Sarah, especially, for this invitation, because I know that these conversations can sometimes be very circular and redundant, and I'm the expert coming into this, but the reality is all of us have some wisdom to share about this experience and how we can make the movement expand. So I just want to continue to offer that gratitude to you both, and to everyone on the call who is actively listening, who's asking questions, and who hopefully leave with something meaningful from this space.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so
Absolutely
much.
did. Thank you so much.
Thanks
Everybody. We'll see you soon. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.